Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program, Assemblyman Will Barclay. Will Barclay represents Jefferson, Onondaga, and Oswego counties, and that's the 120th Assembly District in New York State. We want to thank you folks throughout the region for joining us. Assemblyman Barclay, it's nice to see you.
Mike, it's good to be here.
It's kind of a different time at the state capitol right now. There's a lot of focus, instead of what's going on here in Albany in the legislative chambers, a lot of attention being focused on New York City courtrooms this week, last week, this coming week, as some major power players in the Albany leadership are finding themselves, after having been charged and convicted of corruption, finding themselves getting sentenced. From what we saw this past few days was the sentencing of former Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver. 20 years he was Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and he received a sentence of 12 years in prison, forfeiture of $5.2 million, and they're saying that's all money he gained from his illicit activity, using his position for personal gain, and then a fine of $1.75 million on top of that. I think it's safe for me to say that's pretty much been the focus of attention here at the state capitol.
Sure has, and rightfully so. I mean, obviously what Shelley Silver did was egregious. I'm glad that the case is over, and I'm glad that he got the penalties he did. I thought the penalty fit the crime, frankly. I think a lot of people thought maybe as he was going into the sentencing he would never get 12 years. I didn't know the extent of the forfeiture of $5 million and the 1.7 on top of it is pretty substantial. But, you know, when you betray the public trust, Mike, there's got to be some real consequences to those actions. So I think the court recognized that and threw the book at him, and I'm glad they did, and I'm glad that this case is behind us. You would hope that, all right, we've had so many, corruption cases over the last decade or so here in Albany. You hope that was kind of the last one. We had kind of a big blow with both the Speaker and with the Majority Leader, Gene Skelos, in the Senate, who's yet to be sentenced, but that's coming up, I think,
in
soon.
Just a matter of days.
And I suspect that will be a similar type penalty. You hope, all right, well, one, there's a lesson to be learned, and maybe all this is get behind us. I mean, we talked about us being the most dysfunctional legislature. We've talked about us being the most, now unfortunately, the most corrupt legislature. You hope with these kind of big players getting sentenced that we can maybe start a fresh page and move on. And then lo and behold, next thing comes down, we see that the governor's office is now being investigated for crimes involving the Buffalo Billion and other state projects around the state. And I just heard today on the radio that they raided two former aides of Governor Cuomo's houses to, I guess, get information to follow up on some of the potential crimes that are committed there. So, maybe we're moving out of the legislature, but it's not any better moving into the executive branch. So it's really, I think, a tragic situation. It doesn't help us at all when we try to govern, because I think the people's trust in government, and rightfully so, is probably at a low ebb in New York history, and we're certainly doing nothing to help that feeling out. I mean, and make people feel better and trust government. And so it makes doing everything, I think, more difficult, and it tarnishes, frankly, a lot of my colleagues who are down here that are really trying to do what's right for the state and what's right for their constituents.
And I know it's a long way from Oswego and Onondaga and Jefferson counties, but even the mayor of New York City is finding himself under that same spotlight of a criminal, a federal investigation. I don't know if criminal is the right word, but it's hard to parse things sometimes when you're dealing with these issues and all that we have seen over the past weeks. You go back to Speaker Silver without going through all the details. He basically was taking state money, giving it to a doctor for medical research, and then that money was that doctor was referring patients of his with the cancer, the mesothelioma situation, to the Speaker's law firm, and then he was getting a percentage, and it was just money that was going around, leaving the state, and on the surface, you wouldn't have seen it, you wouldn't have noticed it, but it was when people started taking a closer look, and I think part of that, the part of the problem there, is that the disclosure laws at the state capitol really aren't, they're not open enough.
Well, they're getting there. I mean, that's one thing I think a very positive change we've made over the last few years is greater disclosure. So any outside income now has to be disclosed, and it can be reviewed by any citizen of the state or by the media. So I think that's a very positive, and that's actually one of the things that apparently tripped up the speaker was they noticed, or they had him getting the money, but he hadn't been disclosing the money. So that was one of the crimes that he committed. He wasn't disclosing it. So I think that's a very positive change. The one thing I don't think we've done a good enough job is on member items, and that's how he was funneling some of the money back to this doctor through the Columbia. It was the Columbia that he was working for. I can't.
Yes.
I don't want
Yes. I think so.
In any event, so he was providing member item money to that as part of the kind of the racket he had with for all the clients. And you see this time and time again. Now we're seeing it, unfortunately, with the Buffalo Billion. What happens is there's huge sums of monies that are available to legislators that are handing it out, and there's not real accountability on this money. I think if we had better accountability on the member items, there's nothing inherently wrong with member items. In fact, you can do a lot of good in your districts on various projects. But if you have a project that you think should deserving of government money, taxpayers' money, at the very least, it seems reasonable to have that lined out in the budget so everybody can see and who got the money in the budget to get the money in the first place. So it seems to me a very, I would say, I haven't looked at it, but 70 or 80% of all these corruption usually starts off with some member item money going through, and we see it time and time again. So I think at the very least we have to bring some accountability to that system and more transparency to that system. So very like we did with outside income, we should do being something very similar to legislative grants and member item money.
One of the things that seems to have become common, as we've seen, I think there's like a dozen New York State legislators in jail right now serving time. I think the number is about 30 since the year 2000 have left their office because of criminal charges. Is elected officials setting up these not-for-profits and then funneling state monies into them, and then there's no real rules as to how that money can be spent. They're spending it on themselves, on their families.
Yeah, it's tragic. I mean, very often they have a family member we saw that with Pedro Espada. He had his son or something working for the not-for-profit that he set up and was making, it's not small sums, Mike. It was, a couple $100,000 or more money as a, vice president of the not-for-profit. So it was very self-serving, and obviously it was corrupt. So hopefully there have been some reforms on that, particularly setting up not-for-profits and putting your family members in. You no longer can direct money where you have a family member working, which I think seems like a very common sense progression. But there's more that needs to be done on that. And really what we really need is we got to get away from these pools of money. There's pools of billions of dollars of money that various leaders, particularly in the legislature, have access to without any kind of accountability to where the money is going. That's got to change, because that's really where I see the source of much of this corruption down here. There's a few other easy things we can do. One of the reasons the speaker was able to get away with these crimes because he was very powerful. He had amassed a huge amount of power over the 20 years as he served speaker. So there were always suspicions around that maybe something was not on the up and up. But I think anyone that had ability to do something about that was nervous because he was a very powerful figure. We ought to put term limits in for leadership so someone can't sit there for 20 years and amass a great amount of power and favors from people, and then they were essentially led to people maybe turning a blind eye to some of the crimes they're committing. The other thing about term limits for leadership, frankly, bring in new energy. A lot of this stuff, Silver personally blocked. He wouldn't allow certain bills to get to the floor to have a vote on. MMA is one of the mixed martial arts bill is one thing that comes to mind when you probably had over 100 members in the assembly out of a body of 150 supporting this bill and said they would vote for it, but he refused to bring it for whatever reason, to get it to the floor.
But what was that reason? It really makes you wonder. Right. Another example, a parallel example of that is tort reform.
Right.
The guy was a tort lawyer and would never allow any sort of tort reform measure that would be good for the people, bad for the lawyers, to come to the state assembly floor.
Right across the board. There's a whole host of examples you say. So, in some of those reasons were maybe political, and there's nothing wrong with politics. It's in our daily lives. But nevertheless, you shouldn't be able to amass that much power. Sometimes having new blood in there gives new ideas, new ability to do things. So I think that would be an easy reform that we could do to combat some of the problems that we've had over the last few decades with corruption.
One of the things that I think upsets the people most when they hear about these things, and when they saw the juries announce guilty verdicts for Speaker Silver and for Senate Majority Leader Skelos, is that the first thing those people do is file for their state pension, and they start receiving it, and there's nothing anybody can do about them getting whatever sentence they're going to get and still receiving their state pension.
I think if you pull the pension forfeiture for betraying the public trust or for corruption, you lose your state pension. I think if you pulled that question in New York State, and they have, it's something like 90% of the people support it. Let's not give people the New York State pension that are convicted of corruption. It seems like such a no-brainer. And for whatever reason, particularly I think our House and the Assembly wants to keep it extremely, I don't know if they even agree with it, but if they do, they want to keep it extremely narrow, where the state Senate's a little bit broader in who can lose their pensions and for what reasons. But generally, we're talking about abusing the public trust. If you go and take a bribe, there's no way you should be profiting, through your retirement funds that's paid for by the New York State taxpayers. It seems very, I don't know, it seems like a no-brainer, right? And we should just do it. And I think the people in New York State also agree that it's a no-brainer, and we should get it done. And it should have been done last year. And if not last year, there's no reason we don't get this done.
It was close last year. There was an agreement. The governor, the Senate leader, and the speaker, the new speaker, all agreed to do it. At the last minute, the speaker made some changes to the bill in the Assembly. That makes it dead on arrival. Right. It's not going to pass, or it's not going to become law. They passed both houses, but you've got to have the same bill. Right. It almost seems as if they didn't really want it to happen.
Well, that's what you wonder. You wonder, and here we have another opportunity. Why not come forward and explain what your problems are with the pension forfeiture? My guess is they just don't like the concept of people losing their pension. I think, and so they're just coming up with pretextual reasons of why there's a problem with the agreed upon bill that legislative Senate and Assembly and the governor agreed upon.
So you've enumerated a number of things just now, and I'm sure the people watching this program nodding their heads in agreement with you that these are the things. Isn't it kind of sad though that this legislature, faced with all that it has seen, with legislators sitting in jail cells, the speaker just getting 12 years and all that money in fines and forfeiture, more to come. And the legislature hasn't done one single thing yet to do anything about it.
It's extremely frustrating, but I think one of the problems is there's a lot of bait and switch going around out there. The governor says, well, we need ethics reform, and then you hear good government groups say, well, we need ethics reform. No one is defining exactly what ethics reform is. The piece of ethics reform that I just enumerated, I think, it takes on some very entrenched power in Albany. That entrenched power, and it's not just in the legislature, it's special interests, it's people that have business in front of the legislature, the leadership, they don't want to give up that power. So those things that I think will make the biggest difference, like term limits for leadership, I mean, the leaders aren't going to agree to that because why would they want to give up their power? But that's a problem. We got to make sure that the people in New York State and the media understand what the real ethics reforms are that are going to make a difference, and not get thrown off by public financing of campaigns. That's, in my mind, isn't really going to solve the corruption problems. I forget some of the other proposals out there that just seem like sort of a bait and switch type situation. We should focus on those reforms that are actually going to make a difference. But those, unfortunately, are the hardest reforms to get instituted.
I'm going to ask the best question of this entire program right now, and I've only got 30 seconds to give you to answer it. But the Speaker's defense and what we hear from the mayor of New York City is that, this is just the way things get done, people. That's their defense. This is why it's okay for them to have done what they did. Is that part of the problem?
Isn't that awful? I mean, I do think there is a historical problem, Tammany Hall coming out of New York City, where they were traditionally used to getting away with that stuff, but just because that's the way business is done doesn't mean that's the way it should be done, and we have a lot of problems in state government, and certainly ethics doesn't need to be on the forefront of these problems. Let's face some of the problems we have with our economy, with taxes, government spending, right across the board. We should do something to take those reforms I talked to take ethics off the table. So
we're going to be watching just a few weeks to go in this 2016 legislative session. Will Barclay, thanks for joining us. Thank you, folks, too. We'll hope to see you all soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.